The first thing you need to know is that slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment in 1865, but this is a picture of a Mississippi cotton plantation taken in 1901, to which I say, what? Now here's where I tell you that although the coercive labor system that we call slavery was indeed abolished in 1865, it wasn't long after that that a new labor system called sharecropping, which some historians call slavery by a different name, rose to take its place. So in this video, let's compare slavery to sharecropping and try to figure out if slavery was indeed abolished or whether it continued on under another name. And hey, if you're an APUSH or you're studying for an APUSH exam, I'm going to tell you exactly what you need to know about these two labor systems. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, well then let's get to it. First of all, you have to understand that the bulk of the Southern economy before the Civil War depended on agriculture, most notably the growth of cotton. If a planter was wealthy enough to own a sizable plantation and an enslaved workforce to keep it productive, there was almost no limit to the wealth that such a planter could generate in the antebellum South. Now, under the system of slavery, black men, women, and children were considered the property of the one who owned them, and the word for that is chattel slavery. Now, despite the fact that the Southern social code taught that a slave owner was, in a sense, a father over his enslaved laborers, and thus ought to care for them and protect them, this theoretical paternalism did not prevent extreme abuses from taking place, or maybe that was in fact the cause of such abuses. Now, one of the best descriptions of this brutality that I know of comes from a former slave who escaped and gained his freedom in the North, and his name was Frederick Douglass. Now, when he was a teenager, he was sold to a family, and upon performing a task incorrectly, was whipped severely, and here it is in his own words. Mr. Covey gave me a very severe whipping, cutting my back, causing the blood to run, and raising ridges on my flesh as large as my little finger. Now, after several months of this kind of brutality, Douglass reported a result far more devastating than the physical destruction of his body. In fact, he talks about the destruction of his soul. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold, a man transformed into a brute. Now, not only were enslaved workers forced to work long hours in difficult conditions, and not only were they brutalized for any deviation from those orders, this system had a way, as Douglass claimed, of dehumanizing the slave. He said, behold, a man transformed into a brute. Additionally, under the system of slavery, the owner had full authority to sell laborers as he saw fit, and this often meant the breaking up of husbands and wives and parents and children. Enslaved black people had officially no agency over their own lives, although they did find ways to protest such a system by slowing down work, or in more extreme cases, escaping altogether. Okay, so that is the briefest of sketches regarding slavery before the Civil War. Now, in the closing year of the Civil War, a new constitutional amendment was proposed and ratified, namely the 13th Amendment. And this amendment officially banned slavery in the United States. In order to gain access back into the Union, the defeated Southern states had to agree to this amendment, so legally speaking, slavery was a dead relic of a past age. But big but. Massive but. I wouldn't be making this video if there wasn't a but. But the question we're considering is this: did the system of slavery endure in the South after it was constitutionally abolished? And the answer, as any good answer in history is complicated. So let me tell you a little bit of the story, and then we're going to compare this new labor system to slavery and see if we can have some clarity. Now, think of this conundrum. With the Union victory in the war, and with the abolition of slavery being a condition for Southern re-entry into the Union, what was going to practically happen? Millions of enslaved laborers would all of a sudden become free, and how in the world are they going to earn a living for themselves? Remember, a great majority of them had labored on plantations, and so farming was the only work that they knew. And so Lincoln, understanding this, instructed his General William Tecumseh Sherman to solve that problem. And the result was Sherman's Field Order number 15, which mandated that 400,000 acres of land be distributed to newly freed black citizens of the South. And on that land, they could establish a home and grow crops for their own survival and for sale on the market. But Lincoln went ahead and got himself assassinated, and his successor, the turd Andrew Johnson, put the kibosh on Sherman's field order. So what option did the freed black population of the South have? Well, they had to work for wages. Now, by 1866, Southern black citizens still held out hope that the federal government would grant them land, and therefore many of them refused to sign any labor contracts. And in that way, in the first years after the war, black laborers seemed to have the upper hand. Because of this, there was a severe shortage of workers available to plantation owners. And when a planter did hire a freedman, there was no guarantee of keeping him or her, because if another planter offered better wages, then they could just take up their work elsewhere. But heavy rains and drought in 1866 to 1867 led to dangerously pitiful crop yields, so whatever upper hand black workers had was lost as a result. Now, because of the low crop yields and because many of plantation owners banded together to prevent freedmen from purchasing land, many former slaves had little choice but to enter into contractual arrangements to work the land of the plantation. Now, why would they do that? Well, Southerners feared making land available to freedmen who could afford it because they witnessed what happened as a result of abolition in the British Caribbean. Down there, freed slaves largely preferred to secure and work their own land instead of returning to the large sugar plantations of their enslaved years. And therefore, the highly profitable sugar economy nearly collapsed. Therefore, Southern plantation owners sought to reestablish their authority over their laborers through contractual arrangements that did look a lot like slavery. Some contracts involved gang labor from sun up to sundown. Many mandated complete obedience to the planter. A common set of stipulations prohibited blacks from leaving the plantation and gave them no freedom to entertain visitors or hold meetings without first getting permission from their employer. However, to a workforce that had gained its freedom after generations of slavery, many refused to abide by these stifling rules. For example, when an Alabama planter forbade one of his freedmen laborers to marry, the laborer just up and left rather than submit to the regulation. Listen to how historian Eric Foner says this in his book on Reconstruction. Planters' inability to establish their authority arose from the clash between their determination to preserve the old forms of domination and the freedmen's desire to carve out the greatest possible independence for themselves and their families. So, the planters want to maintain the old system, but their black workers want to assert their constitutional independence, and that's creating tension on Southern plantations. So, by 1870, a new economic arrangement was coming to replace wage labor on plantations, and that was sharecropping. By the end of Reconstruction in 1877, it was the dominant labor arrangement in the South. And the idea was that since poor laborers, and sharecropping involved both black and white laborers, since they couldn't afford to buy land for themselves, nor the tools or livestock to farm it, plantation owners would allow their tenants to rent the land. And how would the farmers pay that rent? Well, with a share of the crop that was produced at harvest time, and that's why it's called sharecropping. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some historians call sharecropping slavery under another name, and there is some truth to that. Black sharecroppers, because they were dependent on the planters' land, often went into debt, and they had to purchase their clothing and their plows and their mules on credit, and often that credit was offered at enormous interest rates. And so if the crop wasn't enough to pay off the debt, and it often wasn't, it was piled onto the rest of the debt, and by this means many black sharecroppers were stuck on their land under the authority of the white planters. And in a lot of ways, this system did look a lot like the old system of slavery, the physical brutality included. For example, Henry Blake was a sharecropper, and he was interviewed in the 1930s, and he recounts an experience he had with his landlord who charged a bottle of syrup to Blake's account. Now, Blake claimed that he never got that syrup, and so the two came to blows over it. And listen to Blake's account. As I turned to go down the steps, he struck me a powerful blow on the back of my head, and I fell from the porch to the ground. I was not entirely senseless, but I was stiff and could not move hand or foot. While I lay before his door, he told me that if I died, he would pay my wife $50. I hope there will be some law sometime for us poor oppressed people. If we could only get land and have homes, we could get along, but they won't sell us any land. Now, the blow to the back of his head actually paralyzed Blake permanently, and by Blake's own admission, there was nothing that he could do about it since the legal system of the South would in no way defend him. So, it seems like sharecropping was indeed slavery under another name. But it's more complicated than that. So let me tell you how sharecropping was different than slavery. For example, look at these two maps of the same plantation published in a magazine called Scribner's Monthly. On the left, you can see the plantation as it was in 1860, and notice how all the buildings are bunched together. Those living quarters where the enslaved people lived were right under the nose of the planter, and with that kind of proximity, he could keep a watch over his labor force. But here on the right, you can see the same plantation 21 years later under the sharecropping system. Notice how the living quarters of the laborers are scattered around the property now. Just the organization of these buildings alone tells you that there was a significant shift, and it indicates that sharecroppers at least had some sense of personal autonomy apart from the watchful eye of the planter. And again, listen to Eric Foner. While sharecropping did not fulfill blacks' desire for full economic autonomy, the end of the planters' coercive authority over the day-to-day lives of their tenants represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power in rural society and afforded blacks a degree of control over their time, labor, and family arrangements inconceivable under slavery. So this means that black laborers, even while many of them were going into debt under a coercive system, were no longer chattel, and they would to a greater extent determine their own destiny. Truthfully, it seemed like everyone and everything was working against them, but with the foundation laid here, they would work for further rights and freedom in the next 100 years. Now listen, if you're wondering how to earn the complexity point on your essays, I would encourage you to watch this video again. This is how you do it. Was sharecropping slavery under another name? Well, kind of yes and kind of no. Anyway, click right over here for some more APUSH published videos in this period. And if you want more help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, then grab my ultimate review packet right here. Heimler out.